If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Law by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we will be looking at the Wraith basics, what you need to know in order to survive in this world of darkness, as well as a very brief overview of the Shadow, Spectres, and Ghostly Legions. Good evening, welcome, and thank you ever so much for your application. It is such a delight to have someone so enthusiastic join our team, especially during the late night hours. Anyone would have thought you were a vampire or something. Anyway, jokes aside, I'm sure you remember who I am, but just for the sake of formalities, I am Dr. Frederick Phoenix, co-founder of the Phoenix Institute. You could say that we are a secret organization, if that gets the feathers ruffled. Anyway, we are hired by private parties to investigate areas where potential hauntings of the restless dead may occur. Currently, we believe that the abandoned Ashburn Manor is under the influence of such supernatural activity, but we will slowly deal with all of Hemingworth in due course. But you won't be doing any of that. Well, not immediately anyway. You need to go through the basic training. Oh yes, we take this very seriously. This isn't a televised program or some crappy podcast, you know. This is the real deal, my good person. We are a business, and we have work to do, as do the ghosts, as it so happens. Ghosts and spirits in our line of work are different names for the same thing, but both of us and the ghosts often prefer Wraith. We are born and raised as puny humans, and at some point we just die. Always tragic, always left with some unfinished business. Most of our spirits could just move on to the next destination, be it heaven or hell, with no need to cling on to such affairs like Papa and his favourite heroin needle. There are some such things left undone that is enough to prevent some from going to either hell or heaven, dying them to this existence. These restless undead are the focus of our studies. Wraiths are spirits of the dead who, for whatever reason, have not given up on the mortal existence and have not moved on from their former lives. From my understanding, most cling to things that are incredibly close to them, places, people, personal items, and the like. These fetters bind the spirits to our world, the material world, the world of the living, or as they call it, the skinlands. The fetters also serve as an anchor, preventing them to be pulled into oblivion. And that isn't some fancy metaphor. Oblivion is entropy itself, a constantly churning force of destruction and madness from which there is said to be no return. Oblivion seeps beneath everything: the labyrinth, the tempest, the shadowlands, and the skinlands. But what are these places? Glad you asked. As we just covered, many of the ghosts are attached to the material world. There are others that dwell within the underworld, primarily in the Shadowlands, which is the realm of the underworld closest to our own, the Skinlands, divided by a thin membrane known as the Shroud, that generally prevents ghosts from entering our world. I can inform you that is particularly thin here, judging by the readings of our machines here. It means that ghosts have continually traversed here, wearing the Shroud down. They can see us, you know, the ghosts I mean. Our research has shown us that there was a time most ancient to us where spirits just came and went as they pleased. It was only when mortals grew scared that the Shroud somehow came into being. Wraiths cannot interact with the physical realm for the most part, but when they do, mortals do not acknowledge it as ghostly activity. It was just the wind or a trick of the eye. You've heard these responses before, yes? Well, these are the brain's way of defending our eyes from acknowledging said spirits. A self-imposed delirium, so to speak. The Wraiths call this the fog, and whilst you think everyone is susceptible to this strange force, that is simply not the case. We performed a series of tests and found that children and animals were mostly immune to their effects, as their relationship with death is most dissimilar to us grown-ups. We also found that cats particularly could stare back through the Shroud and into the Shadowlands. The Shadowlands are very similar to our own, but oh so very different. It runs parallel to our own, but few can see it. Perhaps it might be easier for you to understand it as a blanket that covers the Skinlands. A multitude of subtle differences makes up the world of Wraiths. The shadows that cast are darker and longer, highlighting decay rather than obfuscating it. The churches are more gothic with more gargoyles to boot, whose wicked designs claw up the architecture. The winds howl louder and the cold is more bitter. You get the general idea now, I'm sure. A Wraith living in the Shadowlands of New York, for example, can walk from Manhattan to the Bronx, but objects are still remembered in the living world still exist in the Shadowlands, so I suspect that the Twin Towers still exist there. A city of the Shadowlands is called a necropolis, by the way, plural being necropoli. The Tempest, simply put, are the seas of the underworld, which are said to be forever howling, whereas the Labyrinth houses the most sinister of wraiths. As the name would imply, it is very difficult to traverse for a whole host of reasons, mostly because it is constantly shifting. It is quite the horrific barrier to oblivion, but I feel we need an entire evening to unpack all of that. I do apologise, but I seem to have gone on a little tangent. I'm sure you're not used to that. Anyway, let us return back to the ghost directly, shall we? After all, one must know the potential dangers you may face when you eventually go a splunkering in the underworld. Wraiths instinctively know they have sharpened senses. They can pick up the faintest of scents, the tiniest of whispers, and the smallest details of their eyes if they so wished. Whilst it makes it very difficult for us to plan and hide anything against them, we can use this to our advantage. We are able to temporarily overwhelm them with sensory overload and even damage them. What we can't properly prepare ourselves for is the fact that they are insubstantial. They can pass through walls and bullets just fly through them, unfortunately, but it does make it more difficult for them to interact with physical objects. There are some who can return to their mortal body as arisen, but that is a whole can of worms to be dealing with right now, so let us return to that another night, shall we? Anyway, our research has shown us that wraiths contain 2 additional senses to our own, which you could argue is an extension of their eyesight. I don't believe this. Wraiths possess something known as a life sight, which may seem ironic for the dead, but it makes far more sense than it appears to be, I assure you. Ghosts are able to see the auras of living beings, which they refer to as quicks, the beings, not the auras, which originates from the Apostles' Creed, an ancient symbol of faith. Anyway, wraiths may use this life sight to determine the health, state, and moods in order to work out what we humans are up to and whether we are lying. All of these things are determined by a series of swirling colours, according to our research. We have also concluded that wraiths have an accompanying death sight, which very much affects their outlooks. Our world, to them, appears to be dying, which technically isn't wrong. Humans exhibit a corpse-like deathly pallor, plants are withered and decaying, and the buildings are meant to appear as if they are about to crumble. In short, wraiths can see all that is tainted by oblivion. On a practical level, they can see the weak spots on buildings and know how healthy they are. Or not. Wraiths have a variety of other powers as well, but there are some things I have to explain to you before I start talking about said gifts. Ghosts require no material sustenance but instead feed on emotions, fueling their existence through the use of Pathos, the energy of pure emotion. They do this by feeling an emotion connected with their passion, which are emotions intimately connected to their identity. For example, a wraith who in their former life who was a physicist, may wish to have that unpublished manuscript published. In general, passions are greater in importance than broader activities, but not too specific. Wraiths can also acquire Pathos in other ways, such as sleeping in their fetter, which they refer to as a slumber. One can also make another feel an emotion strongly attached to their passions, or, in certain circumstances, drain it from another wraith. We also discovered some wraiths possess artifacts to give them a little boost as well. Such artifacts are made of other wraiths, but more on that another night. With this acquired Pathos, wraiths use it primarily in 2 ways. Wraiths can heal their bodies, which they refer to as corpus, their bodies I mean, which is made out of a material they call plasm, which is not to be confused with the sci-fi equivalent. Should they sustain too much damage, they enter a harrowing. Harrowings are surrealistic passion plays where the wraith is psychologically tortured by their shadow into surrendering. Harrowings can be triggered for other reasons besides damage, such as losing a fetter. I will touch upon the shadow in just a moment. The primary use of Pathos, however, is to fuel their mystical powers, which are called arconus, the plural being arconai. It is these gifts that allow wraiths to interact with the living and the dead. There are many powers that the wraiths can wield, so to go through them all in detail now would be rather silly. What I will share is that the excessive use of arconai leaves various markings which our research states are dependent on the arconus in question. It is usually more difficult for wraiths to use their powers in the Skinlands, but certain factors can make it easier. Such things include, but are not limited to, visits to graveyards, usage of seances or Ouija boards, the stroke of midnight, Friday the 13th, Halloween, or other special holidays or traditions regarding the deceased. There are many of these arconai, most of them associated with one of the many guilds that governs the western undead capital, Stygia, which most certainly requires several nights to discuss fully, as much politics and intrigues fuel their origins, as well as the city itself. And one cannot mention them without mentioning the 8 legions that make up the hierarchy, for which every Stygian wraith is inducted into upon death, based on the circumstance of their death. I can see that you are keen, so allow me to summarize for them for you now. The Iron Legion is headquartered at the Seat of Shadows and overseen by the Ashen Lady. The Iron Legion is comprised of the Victims of Age. The Skeletal Legion, claiming those taken by disease, is headquartered on the Seat of Dust and is overseen by the Skeletal Lord. The Grim Legion, claiming the victims of violence and overseen by the Smiling Lord at the Seat of Burning Waters. The Penitent Legion, claiming the victims of madness, is overseen by the Laughing Lady and quartered at the Seat of Succor. The Emerald Legion, for victims of happenstance, is maintained at the Seat of Thorns by the Emerald Lord. The Silent Legion is overseen by the Quiet Lord and oversees the victims of despair from the Seat of Silence. The Legion of Paupers is quartered at the Seat of Golden Tears, administered by the Beggar Lord and compromising victims of mystery and whoever the Beggar Lord can get away with. Finally, you have the Legion of Fate, consisting of those chosen by fate and administered by the Lady of Fate at the Isle of Eurydice. On the topic of fate, this would be a marvelous opportunity to touch upon the Shadow. You may have heard that voice in your head that tells you to do that naughty thing. The little imp on your shoulder is all too real for wraiths, for the Shadow has a will of its own and is part of the wraith, bent on self-destruction of the wraith. It will bribe, cajole, threaten, and take control of the wraith's psyche to follow through with its selfishly seductive and sadistic goal to pull the wraith into oblivion. The Shadow has its own gifts, known as thorns, that the wraith can employ, but with a cost. The price is always high when you make the deal with the devil. It is an enemy within every wraith endures, the one that can never be vanquished as it toys with your emotions and secrets. It knows you oh so intimately. Whilst the wraith's psyche feeds on pathos, the Shadow is set to feed on angst, the stuff of negative emotions. Shadows can take over the psyche temporarily, an act called catharsis, and if a shadow becomes too powerful, they can take over the wraith permanently, turning the wraith into a spectre. Its humanity and former identity are replaced by pure evil, forgetting its old tethers, friends, and ideals, which keeps it from transcending where the wraith, not the spectre, fundamentally about accepts their death. Specters are minions of oblivion. Now, that should be enough for you to digest for now. I am sure I've replaced many of your original questions with plenty of new ones, most of which I intend to answer in the near future, but doesn't the underworld and its millions of inhabitants fascinate you with a curious sadness? Sure, there is beauty to be found and the light of the human spirit still burns just as passionately as before, but there is much fear, pain, and terror to be found in the Shadowlands. To be kept updated, follow the Law by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we will upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.